CTV's W5. A rapidly warming planet
Changes in the environment up here are going to affect people's ways of lives.
puts our land in peril.
Right before our eyes, it's sort of sloughing off and thawing.
Avery Haines investigates a looming ecological disaster
You can say we're a canary in a coal mine.
as the slowly melting foundation of the
It
North
functions like the glue or the cement that holds the landscape together.
reveals dangers long hidden,
As that permafrost thawed, that anthrax was released.
and the disappearing land
Not one year is the same as the next.
threatens more than distant communities.
What happens when it thaws?
And Latin beats on the BC coast.
He's a real artist.
A Cuban superstar who calls Canada home,
I love my freedom in what I do.
bringing two worlds of music together.
Canada has that soul as a country, you know?
Kevin Newman meets a musician with a message.
Talk to me about what Alex Cuba's meant to this town. He's huge.
It's not where you're from, it's what you feel.
You don't have to be sad.
And when you sing from the heart,
I was doing it because I wanted to.
home is where the music is.
It has to be beautiful. It has to be warm for the soul.
Here is Kevin Newman.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. You've heard a lot about how the Arctic ice is shrinking and how climate change is melting the glaciers. But almost half of Canada sits on permanently frozen land, or permafrost, and it may be the real threat. With this investigation, we welcome Avery Haines to the W5 team. And as she reveals, the rapidly thawing permafrost threatens not only the land we live on, but the air we breathe.
What you're looking at is collateral damage from a battle with an unstoppable enemy. This heaving and cracking road, once one of the main highways in Yellowknife, is the front line of that war. And the proof that we're losing is the fact the Earth's frozen foundation is vanishing.
Permafrost is defined as rock or earth materials that stay frozen for at least 2 years. In the north, it functions like the glue or the cement that holds the landscape together.
That northern landscape can be bleak, yet strikingly beautiful. But it's that same tundra, specifically what's underneath it, that's threatening the north in ways no one can prepare for. It turns out the permafrost isn't quite as permanent as its name would suggest. This is a front row seat to climate change. Permafrost literally crumbling before our eyes. Arctic land sliding into the sea.
This place is called Peninsula Point, and we're about 10 kilometers west of Tuktoyaktuk.
Dustin Whalen is a coastal scientist.
We are at a perfect example of the Beaufort Sea coastline. What we have behind us is about a 10 to 15 meter high cliff that is made up of permafrost, but you can see the massive ice here. And that's ice that is sort of interstitial with layers of sand and sediment. And right before our eyes, it's sort of sloughing off and thawing.
Dustin, you've been going up to Tuk for 13 years. Can you tell me some of the most startling things that have happened and that you've witnessed up there?
One of the most startling things that I see is not one year is the same as the next. Every single year we go, we see dramatic changes. And it's changes to the landscape, it's changes to how the coastline has sort of either thawed or broken off into the ocean. We see these on an annual basis, but if you're there long enough, you can actually see the change on a seasonal and weekly timescale as well. It's amazing when you stand in front of a cliff that is actively eroding right in front of you. You can not only see it, you can hear it.
Permafrost is made up of a number of things, depending on the amount of ice in the permafrost. So at the bottom, we have permafrost that is very ice-rich, and on the top, we have permafrost that has less ice in it. And in fact, if you can see, that's the area that is actually sloughing off the most, right? Because it's unconsolidated.
Almost 23 million square kilometers in the Northern Hemisphere and roughly half of Canada sit on top of some sort of permafrost. In the far north, the permafrost is continuous. The further south you go, the more sporadic it gets. At Woods Hole Research Center in Falmouth, Massachusetts, it's what's trapped inside the permafrost that has them most concerned. And the research team doesn't pull any punches.
There are about 1,500 billion tons of carbon locked up in permafrost in the Arctic.
Senior scientist Max Holmes predicts if the permafrost continues to thaw at its current rate and carbons are unlocked, the potential release of greenhouse gases will have devastating consequences on the Earth's climate.
So there's 3 times more carbon in permafrost than in all the forests on Earth, more than in the fossil fuels left in the ground. And it's essentially twice as much carbon in permafrost as is in the atmosphere right now.
So there's more carbon trapped inside the permafrost than there is in the atmosphere right now?
Yeah, that's right. Roughly twice as much is locked up in permafrost is in the atmosphere. The analogy I like is as if you've put food or vegetables in a freezer. And as long as that freezer remains a freezer, that stuff's going to stay frozen for years and decades and on and on and on. And you can imagine what would happen if you were on vacation, you're away from your house for a week or so, and your freezer broke. That material thaws, it starts to decompose, it starts to rot. It's essentially bacteria eating at that food that you've had in a freezer. And that's what's happening in the Arctic. When that happens, those bacteria are emitting either carbon dioxide or methane, and those are both greenhouse gases, which can cause more warming.
Rising global temperatures are putting a dangerous strain on the Earth's frozen tundra. The top portion of permafrost is called the active layer. Usually about a meter deep, it's normal for this area to freeze and thaw, depending on the ground temperature. But it's the area below that active layer that's critical. That bottom frozen layer can be thousands of years old, and it must stay frozen.
When I first started working in the field of permafrost, there was not a huge amount of interest. And now that we have a relatively rapidly warming climate in the north, permafrost is responding and people are starting to take notice.
Steve Kokal is an environmental scientist in Yellowknife. He sees the results of permafrost thaw daily. He used to drive on this highway on the way to the family cottage.
This is a really nice illustration of what happens to infrastructure constructed on permafrost when it's not maintained. As you can see, we have a road that's subsided and heaved, and this is the result of the thawing of the underlying ice-rich permafrost. When you thaw that ice, the terrain settles and you get this undulating surface. Because permafrost is inextricably linked to climate, as the climate warms, of course, the permafrost will change, and it is actually a very dynamic system. So in reality, the word permafrost is, in essence, a bit of a misnomer. We are finding that some of the most dynamic landscapes in Canada are, in fact, northern landscapes and permafrost landscapes.
North of Yellowknife, in Inuvik, the permafrost is continuous. It's frozen year-round. Scientist Steve Wolf at the Aurora Research Institute has studied the frozen foundation for decades. A walk-in freezer is vital for his lab work, but keeping the permafrost frozen in the outside world is becoming a challenge.
So this is it. This is what permafrost looks like. The part that freezes and thaws every year is right here. The part that stays frozen all year, this is it. You find ice right at the top of the permafrost.
Homes in Inuvik have to be built on stilts, and heating oil, water, and even sewage lines cannot be buried. The frozen permafrost provides a solid foundation to build on. But when it thaws, the impact can be devastating, even in the most remote areas. Just a couple of hours south in Fort McPherson, the landscape is permanently scarred by the big thaw. This lake is about to disappear because of thawing permafrost. Watch as time-lapse photography captures the exact moment when the lake wall collapses. There's nothing left to contain the water, and the mucky mixture carves out its own course, flowing like lava.
Changes in permafrost conditions are going to influence ecosystems. They're going to influence the nature of water. They are also going to influence the communities up here, and the north is the home to many communities. Changes in the environment up here are going to affect people's ways of lives.
And what's happening in one of the most remote outposts of Canada is teetering towards the critical stage. Well beyond the tree line, Tuktoyaktuk is on the front lines in the battle to save precious land from collapsing into the sea.
I guess you can say we're a canary in a coal mine. We're experiencing the most extreme changes that probably anybody in Canada is experiencing.
Daryl Nasagaluk is mayor of the tiny hamlet most people call Tuk. On the shores of the Beaufort Sea, it's home to 1,000 people, and the land is shrinking.
Our people have noticed the permafrost is getting further and further from the surface. Whereas 30, 40 years ago, the permafrost wouldn't be more than a foot down from the surface in the midsummer.
For the elders in the community, permafrost translates into permanent loss of land. Peter Nagasak has lived in Tuk for all of his 71 years. To him, these changes are dramatic.
We must have lost about 500 feet of ground on the ocean side there, all the way down. There used to be Hudson Bay houses down here, and Hudson Bay boat used to be anchored there. They had store, warehouse, a lot of things down there.
On the north shore of Tuk, 3 families had to move, and their homes were torn down because it just became too dangerous.
There was actually 4 structures just this past winter we had to move. One of them was a government Northwest Territories warehouse that actually fell over, that they had to retrieve from the beach, and 3 territorial housing units were also removed.
This is all that's left of the 3 houses that used to hug the sea on the north side of Tuk. A septic tank is the only clue that anyone used to live here before they almost slid into the sea.
I have great pleasure in welcoming the Prime Minister of Canada, His Excellency Justin Trudeau, and I invite him to address the General Assembly.
Even the Prime Minister has acknowledged the issue, in front of the United Nations, no less.
Indigenous and northern communities are particularly affected by its stark reality. In communities across the north, places like Paulattuk, Kugluktuk, and Tuktoyaktuk, community members are finding sea ice conditions more dangerous and unpredictable for traveling and hunting in the winter. In Canada's western Arctic, the permafrost is melting and huge pieces of tundra are eroding into the ocean.
Coastal scientist Dustin Whalen spends his summers in Tuk studying erosion trends. It's the end of August, and on his last day before he heads south and home, Dustin and his boat captain Frank are heading to Pingo National Park.
Are you going to go to the beach, or are you going to go around?
Dustin wants to get a last look at the coastal shoreline that is sliding into the sea. The view from above provides even more dramatic evidence of the rapidly disappearing land.
Erosion rates in the Beaufort Sea are extremely high, higher than maybe anywhere else in the world. There are parts in the Beaufort Sea that are moving up to 45 to 50 meters a year.
Our people are very, very, very close to the land and environment and wildlife. You know, one elder once said that if we lost everything, we still have a bank. And he said that our land and our wildlife is like a bank account. You know, he said our future generations have a secure future because of where we live. We're not panicking.
Unstoppable damage.
Currently, the erosion rate of this island is about 2 meters a year.
And homes built on vanishing land.
This island will be gone very soon.
When W5 continues.
The Pingos stand as a testament to the power of permafrost. The unique Arctic hills were actually formed thousands of years ago by expanding frozen Earth. Now, the same permafrost that created these majestic landmarks is under attack. Coastal permafrost in the far north is disappearing at an alarming rate.
This is a time-lapse camera, And its function really is to take a photograph every single hour for an entire year.
Scientist Dustin Whalen has been tracking the erosion in Tuktoyaktuk.
Currently, the erosion rate of this island is about 2 meters a year. And if you extend that forward, and given the current size of the island, which is about 37 meters, this island will be gone very soon. In fact, in the next 20 years.
You know, I'm thinking anybody who lives anywhere on bluffs anywhere in the world would hear this discussion about the fact that 2 meters of land is eroding every single year. Yeah. And that's a huge number.
It's a huge number, and you make a great point. I mean, there's cottage country all over our country, and people live on these beautiful landscapes on the ocean, and everyone has a story of erosion. But nowhere else in Canada is it eroding as fast as it is up north right now.
The people of Tuktoyaktuk are quite literally losing the land beneath their feet.
For this core, we need to get a sample here, here, and here.
Absolutely.
After spending the summer in Tuk, Dustin and his team are back at the lab in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, crunching numbers. Core samples provide clues as to how much soil has slid into the ocean.
You know, up in Tuk, you can see the dramatic impact that erosion is having on the landscape. This looks like a hunk of mud to a lot of people. To you, this tells a story of what's happening in the seabed.
Yes, it does. And so this is a marine sediment core. What we did was we went just offshore of the island, and we acquired a gravity core. So we dropped a cylinder tube with weight on it onto the seabed and collected this core. So this core has told us a few things, but one of the things it really tells us is the amount of sediment that has been deposited after erosion. At this point, we're looking at a core with 88 centimeters of sedimentation since 1963. When you have that much erosion, the question is, where does all that sediment go? Mm-hmm. And so this core is an excellent example of where that sediment does actually go. And in this case, it just falls right on the seabed. So you can imagine, since this island eroded, right in front of the seabed, it's getting shallower and shallower and shallower.
We know the impact that permafrost is having on the environment. You don't often think about the implication that it would have on the community when it comes to the shipping, which is so vital.
The main navigational channel, in fact, the only navigational channel leading into Tuktoyaktuk Harbor, is getting shallower. And what we can hypothesize is one of the main reasons why this is getting shallower is due to the erosion of Tuktoyaktuk Island.
Land erosion is definitely a concern in the Arctic, but the permafrost thaw has serious health implications worldwide. When the Earth thaws, the results can be lethal. Here in this remote corner of Siberia, a mysterious anthrax outbreak is linked to an animal carcass that was trapped in the frozen tundra. Max Holmes, senior scientist at the Woods Hole Research Center, says there is a real need for concern. A nightmare scenario that includes ancient viruses, bacteria, and disease. A
year ago, there was an anthrax outbreak in Siberia that was traced to a reindeer that died of anthrax many, many decades ago, had been frozen away in the permafrost. As that permafrost thawed, that anthrax was released. So there's certainly a concern that there can be viruses and other viruses and bacteria locked up in the permafrost that could be released when it thaws.
You think about, smallpox is one of the diseases that has been mentioned, or any kind of diseases that Neanderthals might have had. That has been locked in the permafrost.
Yeah, it's a scary scenario, and I can't put a likelihood on, a percentage on how likely that is that that's going to happen. But the fact that we saw some evidence that it already happened in one case in Siberia certainly suggests that, this is yet another reason to work really hard to keep the permafrost frozen.
It's a vicious cycle. As the climate warms, permafrost thaws, allowing organic matter to decompose, releasing greenhouse gases that triggers more warming, more decomposition, and even more greenhouse gases.
Obviously, the question for scientists is what happens when the permafrost, as it is doing now, what happens when it thaws?
You can break that question down and it becomes, okay, how quickly will the permafrost thaw? And then how quickly will that carbon that's locked up in the permafrost decompose and be released as carbon dioxide and methane? And again, those are the questions that keep us and lots of other scientists busy, but we're making progress and we're getting better at answering those questions.
So each one of these jars has a sample of permafrost.
In the lab, climate research scientist Sue Natali is working on trying to get a handle on just how much time we have. What's going to happen when the greenhouse gases are released?
What would happen if all of the carbon that is right now trapped in the frozen permafrost did release?
We would have substantial increases in our global climate. Current estimates are that about 10% of the carbon that's currently in permafrost will be released by 2100. That's about 150 billion tons of carbon that can be released by the end of the century.
What you're saying is, the reality is that all of the predictions of how much the Earth is warming up have not taken into account the massive, vital aspect of what happens when permafrost thaws.
That's correct.
And so what does that look like? If you were to have to look into the future and see what your kid's life could be like if things aren't changed now?
It's difficult. It's difficult as a parent to think about the worst case, and I don't even want to go there,
Can you? Will you go there just because I'm curious?
8 billion people, with a bunch of them living in places that are inhospitable, where food may be in short supply, looking at a country that's still doing relatively well. It's kind of the problems that we have now magnified to a great deal, and that's a tough place to be.
And Avery is here now. We're so delighted you're part of W5.
It's so great to be here.
This is obviously really worrisome. And like the glaciers, you can't really get the permafrost back.
This is what's mind-boggling, to listen to these scientists talk about the fact that by 2100, 70% of the Earth's permafrost could be thawed. And with that thaw comes the release of all of these ancient carbons and methane into the atmosphere.
70%. Is there anything that can be done to slow that down?
Obviously, they'd love to have a way to refreeze the permafrost. It's not possible. No. But they do say that if drastic steps are taken now, right now, they can reduce that 70% thaw to 30% in that same time frame, which is more tenable.
All right. Boy, the politics around this, though, has been so hard, it's hard to imagine how they're going to get there.
There are very specific big and small ways that they can reduce emissions, and we'll have details on the W5 website.
All right. Great to have you again.
Thanks.
All right. And here's what's straight ahead on W5.
Celebrated for his talent, but true to his passion.
It only takes 1 little piece of good news. A song is coming down.
When W5 continues,